Everyone in Stony Brook knew Malene West, not because she was popular or loud or someone who commanded attention, but because she was impossible to ignore. She walked with a limp that made her an easy target and carried herself with a quiet strength that made people uneasy. At 15, she had already been through more than most adults twice her age. Her world was a weather-beaten farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a worn-out barn, and a horse named Daisy, who understood her better than any human ever had. Every morning began before the sun with the soft creak of the floorboards under her uneven gait, the cold kiss of the farmhouse window pane against her forehead as she watched the mist drift over frost-laced fields that once belonged to a thriving horse ranch. Those days were gone. Now it was just her exhausted mother Rachel, and her grandfather Joseph, holding on to the last threads of the West family name with calloused hands and unyielding resolve. Life had never offered Malene a straight path. Born with cerebral palsy, she had learned early how to move in a world that wasn't built for her. She didn't complain, not when her left leg refused to follow the right, not when kids whispered behind her back, not even when her father died and left a silence in the house that no one had managed to fill. Her world was split into two parts: the safe quiet of the farm and the battlefield of Stony Brook High School, where every hallway was a gauntlet and every class a minefield. At home, she was capable, slow, yes, but determined, competent, even gifted when it came to horses. But at school, she was Wobbles, an insult disguised as a joke, passed around in sneers and snickers by the same boys who wore varsity jackets like armor and used charm as a weapon. She knew how to keep her head down, how to disappear. Or at least she thought she did. That Friday started like any other, with a whispered promise to the framed photograph of her father on her nightstand. "I'll make you proud today, Dad." The photo never answered, but she liked to think he heard her. She pulled on her boots, smoothed her chestnut hair into a braid, and braced herself for the familiar ache in her hip as she walked out to the barn. Daisy was waiting, the old mare's soft eyes lighting up the moment she saw her. It was the only part of the day Malene looked forward to, those early minutes brushing Daisy's coat, whispering secrets into her ear, pretending the world outside the pasture didn't exist. But it did. It always did. The school bus rumbled over the hill like a warning bell, and Malene sighed, giving Daisy one last pat before grabbing her bag and heading toward whatever the day had in store. By third period, it had already started. Caleb Mitchell, son of the richest man in town and the kind of boy who never heard no, had brushed past her in the hallway, knocked her books to the floor, and offered his signature smirk as she knelt slowly, painfully, to gather them. He didn't say anything cruel this time. He didn't have to. His silence was louder than insults. It said, "You don't matter." But something was different today. There was something calculated in the way he looked at her. It wasn't just mockery. It was interest, the kind that made her stomach knot. She didn't understand it yet. Not fully, but she would. At lunch, she sat with Sarah Reynolds, her only real friend, the only person who ever waited for her when the bell rang. They talked about algebra and an upcoming English paper like nothing was wrong. But something was wrong. She could feel it. Caleb was watching her from across the cafeteria, his friends whispering, glancing her way, laughing. Malene tried to ignore it, tried to pretend they were just being their usual cruel selves, but when Sarah leaned in and said, "Caleb said he might talk to you after school," the chill in her spine settled into something worse: dread. After the final bell rang, she found him waiting near her locker, casual, leaning against the wall like he had all the time in the world. His eyes scanned her face, unreadable and smug. "Hey, Wobbles," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You like horses, right?" The question was a trap, but she answered anyway. "Yeah." That one word would be the first step toward everything that followed, toward the dare, the lie, the betrayal. He leaned in closer. "There's a horse at Sullivan's farm. Wild, mean. Everyone says it can't be touched. We're gonna go see it after school. Thought maybe you'd want to prove you're not as weak as you look." Her mouth opened, then closed again. There were 1,000 ways to respond. none of them safe. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $50 bill. "It's easy money, just a look." She stared at the bill like it was a lifeline, not a noose. Their pantry at home was running low. Her mom had skipped dinner twice this week. The car needed repairs they couldn't afford. She was 15 and tired of feeling powerless. "Fine," she said, "but just to look." He smiled like the trap had already sprung, and in that moment, without realizing it, Malene West took the first step toward the pen that would nearly cost her everything, and give her more than she ever thought possible. When the final bell rang that afternoon, Malene gathered her things with the same careful motions she always used. Right hand steady, left hand tight against her chest to avoid the tremor. One slow breath for balance before standing. The hallway had mostly emptied, the familiar click-clack of shoes and lockers slamming shut, fading like the tide. She usually made her way straight to the bus, avoiding eye contact, ignoring the whispers. But not today. Because today, Caleb Mitchell was waiting, and not alone. He stood just outside the front doors with his ever-present shadows, Dylan and Eric, shoulder to shoulder, smug as ever. The kind of boys who laughed with their mouths and insulted with their eyes. They looked up as she stepped outside, and for the briefest moment, Malene thought about turning back, but she didn't. Something stronger than fear kept her feet moving. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the fact that no one ever believed she could do anything on her own. Maybe it was hunger, literal, because they'd skipped breakfast again, or something deeper, a hunger for control over even one decision in a life where she got so few. Caleb stepped forward, his hands in his jacket pockets, eyes cool and appraising. "You sure you're up for this?" he asked, voice low, like they were sharing a secret. "You can back out. No shame in it." Malene met his gaze evenly. "You said just to look," she replied. That was the deal. Behind him, Dylan scoffed and muttered something to Eric, who snorted. Caleb ignored them. "Yeah," he said, "just to look." The truck they piled into was dented and smelled faintly of sweat and fast food, its interior cluttered with sports gear and empty energy drink cans. Caleb drove like he did everything else, fast and without apology, spinning gravel on every corner as they headed out of town toward the Sullivan property. The road turned from asphalt to dirt, and the houses grew farther apart, swallowed by fields and shadowed by trees still bare from winter. Malene sat in the back, fingers tight around the frayed strap of her backpack, jaw clenched, staring out the window at the blur of brown fields and brittle grass. She didn't say a word. Neither did they. But the silence in that truck wasn't empty. It was charged, coiled like something waiting to strike. She could feel the way their eyes lingered on her in the rearview mirror, could hear the barely stifled chuckles as they exchanged glances. She wasn't stupid. She knew they weren't taking her out there out of kindness, but what she didn't know was what, exactly, they planned to do. That was the part that chilled her. They turned off the road and followed a long gravel driveway bordered by rusted fencing. The Sullivan property was older than most in the area, with a weathered barn leaning slightly to the left and a farmhouse with chipped paint and a sagging porch. No lights on, no signs of anyone home. The truck rolled to a stop behind an old equipment shed. "He's not here," Caleb said casually, like it was perfectly normal to trespass. "Went into town. Said we could look, though." Malene's heart thudded louder now, not from excitement but instinct. Every part of her was screaming that this wasn't right, but she pushed it down. She couldn't back out now, not with 3 boys watching, not with a promise hanging in the air and $50 in Caleb's pocket that could buy food for a week. They led her toward the back of the property, where a large corral stood apart from the others. Fenced in high with thick boards reinforced with wire, it looked less like a pen and more like a prison. And pacing inside it, his coat a deep reddish brown that shimmered even in the fading light, was the horse. Wildfire. He was taller than she expected, more powerful. His muscles shifted like corded ropes under his hide, and every movement held a restrained fury, like he was barely tolerating the enclosure. Malene stopped short, breath catching. He was magnificent and terrifying. "There he is," Caleb said, gesturing with a grand sweep of his hand. "Your big moment." Eric laughed. "Looks like he's ready to kill something." "He's beautiful," Malene whispered, more to herself than anyone else, her eyes locked on the Mustang. "He's not a monster." But even as she said it, Wildfire turned, ears pinned, nostrils flaring as he noticed them. His eyes were dark, unreadable. There was intelligence there, yes, but also fury. Malene stepped closer to the fence, instinct pulling her forward despite every logical voice in her head warning her to stop. And Wildfire watched her the entire way, no longer pacing now, just standing still, evaluating, judging. "You said just to look," she reminded Caleb again without turning away from the horse. "That was the deal." Caleb shrugged behind her. Change of plans. And then, in a movement too fast for her to brace, Dylan and Eric grabbed her arms, one on each side. Her scream caught in her throat as she twisted. Too late, too slow. Her leg buckled, and her backpack slipped from her shoulder as they dragged her forward. "What are you doing?" she cried, panic rising like bile. "Stop! I didn't agree to this." Caleb unlatched the gate with a flick of his wrist. "Smile for the camera, Wobbles." Then they shoved her through the opening and slammed it shut behind her. The world tilted. The dirt rushed up to meet her. She hit the ground hard on her side, her weak leg crumpling beneath her, the air knocked from her lungs. And when she looked up, Wildfire was no longer at the far end of the pen. He was walking toward her, slowly, deliberately. She couldn't hear the boys laughing anymore. She couldn't hear anything over the sound of her heart pounding in her ears. She tried to rise, but her body wasn't responding, limbs heavy with fear. Every second dragged like an hour as the Mustang closed the distance, his hooves kicking up small puffs of dust, his head lowered, ears still flat against his skull. Outside the pen, Caleb lifted his phone and hit record, and inside the pen, Malene whispered, "Please." But whether it was to the boys, to the horse, or to God, she didn't know. The air inside the corral was thick with dust and dread. Malene lay crumpled in the dirt, her left leg twisted awkwardly beneath her, the impact of the fall pulsing through her body in waves of pain and shock. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she pushed herself up onto trembling elbows, her heart pounding so hard it drowned out every sound but the muffled thud of approaching hooves. She didn't need to look up to know he was coming. She could feel it, the vibration in the ground, the tension hanging between each breath like a drawn bowstring ready to snap. Wildfire was moving toward her, and there was nothing between them now. No fence, no barrier, no escape. The Mustang's shadow stretched long in the dying light, growing with every step until it swallowed her whole. The boys outside the pen had gone quiet. Even they knew this had crossed some unseen line, though none of them had the guts to say it out loud. Dylan had stopped recording. Eric had backed a few feet from the gate, but Caleb stood where he was, arms folded, expression unreadable, watching with the kind of sharp interest usually reserved for wrecks and fires and things people weren't supposed to look at but couldn't turn away from. He wanted a show. He wanted fear. He wanted this girl who never flinched, never fought back, never gave them the satisfaction to finally break. Wildfire stopped a dozen feet away, snorting once, sharp and loud like a warning. His ears twitched, his body coiled like a spring. Malene didn't move. She couldn't. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her body knew better, knew she wouldn't make it 2 steps before collapsing. She was small, vulnerable, a fragile, trembling thing against a wall of muscle and wild fury. Everything she'd ever learned about horses told her to stay still, not to challenge, not to cry, not to plead. But the fear was there, raw and real, a scream caught in her chest that begged to be let out. She forced herself to meet his gaze. His eyes weren't red with rage like the rumors had said. They were dark, sharp, and somehow aware. He wasn't charging, not yet. He was assessing her, reading her, the same way she had watched him minutes ago from the other side of the fence. Something flickered in her chest. Not hope, not exactly, but a sliver of something that wasn't terror. She swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes, and whispered, "I'm not here to hurt you." The horse took one more step, then paused, tossing his head. Dust swirled around them, stirred by the breeze, and time seemed to slow. Maline's voice, though shaky, filled the silence again. "They think we're both broken, don't they?" She wasn't even sure where the words came from, some deep part of her, older than pain, more honest than fear. "But we're not. We're just tired of being told what we can't do." Wildfire's ears shifted forward. His massive body stopped vibrating with tension. He cocked his head, just slightly, as though listening. Outside the pen, Eric took a hesitant step forward. "Caleb, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Caleb snapped, his voice lower now, uncertain. "She's fine." But his tone betrayed him. Even he wasn't sure anymore. Maline slowly pushed herself to a kneeling position, wincing as pain shot up her side, but she kept her eyes on the Mustang. "I know what they say about you. Dangerous, violent, just like they say I'm slow, useless." Her voice cracked and she steadied herself. "But maybe they're wrong." Wildfire moved again. Closer now, close enough that she could see the scars on his chestnut coat. Long, thin lines that told a story of ropes and spurs, of men who had tried to force obedience instead of earning trust. His breath steamed in the cooling evening air as he lowered his head, just a few feet from hers now. Maline didn't reach out. She didn't dare. She just stayed still, her pulse pounding, her heart aching from something more than just fear, recognition. "You're not the only one who's been hurt," she whispered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Wildfire stepped forward again, one slow, deliberate pace, and lowered his muzzle until it hovered inches from her shoulder. The warmth of his breath sent a shiver through her, but she didn't move, didn't flinch. And when his nose brushed her arm, gentle as falling snow, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Outside the pen, no one spoke. Even Caleb stood frozen, his smirk gone, replaced with something harder to name. Disbelief, confusion, maybe even fear. The Mustang's head remained near hers, his breathing slow and steady. The tension had melted from his posture. No raised hooves, no charge, no panic, just a quiet, impossible calm. Then, suddenly, the silence shattered. Tires on gravel, a truck, headlights sweeping across the field, doors slamming, voices, footsteps crunching. Mark Sullivan's shout cut through the dusk like thunder. "What in God's name?" Joseph West's voice followed, hoarse with panic. "Maline!" Wildfire jerked his head up, startled by the noise, his ears going flat. But instead of bolting, instead of reverting to the wild, rearing fury they all expected, he stepped back, slowly, giving her space, his eyes never leaving her face. Maline didn't notice the panic around her, didn't register the gate swinging open or the hands rushing toward her. She only knew the horse had made a choice. He hadn't hurt her. He hadn't feared her. He'd seen her, and that changed everything. Maline barely registered the arms lifting her from the ground, or the urgent voices surrounding her as she was carried from the pen. Her body was weak, trembling, but it wasn't just from the fall or the terror of the last few moments. It was from something far more profound, something that neither her mother's warnings nor her own logic could explain. The image of Wildfire standing there, calm, unthreatening, his dark eyes locked on hers with a kind of quiet understanding, replayed over and over in her mind like a song she couldn't stop hearing. She should have been trampled. She should have been rushed to the hospital, broken and bleeding. Instead, she was alive. Not just alive, but seen. It was like the horse had looked past the way she walked, past her twisted leg and awkward arm, and into something deeper, and what he'd found there hadn't frightened him. That alone left her more shaken than any bruise or sprain ever could. Joseph's arms around her felt like iron, protective, furious, afraid. He kept asking her questions, but she couldn't answer them. Her lips moved, but her voice didn't come. Behind them, Mark Sullivan stood near the open gate, his face pale with disbelief as he looked between the Mustang and the girl. Wildfire had retreated to the far side of the pen, his posture no longer aggressive but alert, as though still guarding something. Mark had seen that horsebuck rear, charge, and nearly crush a man under his hooves, and yet here was this 15-year-old girl, fragile and breathless, who had walked away from the pen not only unharmed but seemingly accepted. "What the hell happened?" Mark's voice finally cut through the haze. "How did she get in there?" Joseph turned, his expression a storm. "Ask them." He jabbed a finger toward the three boys now standing stiff near the equipment shed, their bravado stripped away and replaced with a teenage version of panic. Dylan's face was pale, eyes darting toward Caleb like he was waiting for orders. Eric had his arms folded but wouldn't look anyone in the eye. And Caleb stood silent, jaw clenched, hands in his pockets like he could disappear inside himself if he stood still long enough. "She said she wanted to see the horse," Caleb muttered, his tone defensive. "We didn't force her." Joseph's eyes narrowed. "Don't you lie to me, boy. My granddaughter can barely climb stairs without help. You expect me to believe she scaled that fence on her own?" "We didn't touch her," Dylan said quickly, too quickly. "She just went in to look." "She was thrown," Mark interrupted, his voice hard and sure. "I've had cameras on that pen since the last incident. Don't insult our intelligence." The boys froze. Caleb's shoulders stiffened, his entire body tensing as he realized they'd gone further than anyone would excuse. He opened his mouth, probably to argue again, but one look from Mark silenced him. "Get off my property," Mark said. "Now." They didn't hesitate. Caleb led the retreat, jaw locked and fists clenched, Dylan and Eric close behind, their steps crunching the gravel as they disappeared into the darkness without another word. But this wasn't over. Malene knew it. The way Caleb had looked at her just before turning, like she had taken something from him he couldn't explain, told her all she needed to know. He wasn't going to forget this, and he definitely wasn't going to forgive her for making him look small. Rachel arrived at the hospital before they even had Malene in a room. The receptionist barely had time to call back to the nurse's station before she rushed in, eyes wild, asking for her daughter, demanding answers. When they finally brought Malene out, her face pale but eyes open, Rachel nearly collapsed with relief. But it wasn't just fear in her expression, it was guilt, deep and sharp, because part of her had always believed this would happen. Not exactly like this, maybe, but something like it. Because Malene didn't listen, because she pushed when she should have waited, because she wanted to prove something. Back at the farm that night, after the doctor cleared her for minor bruising and exhaustion, the house was heavy with silence. No one wanted to speak first. Rachel hovered, wanting to say something but unsure how to begin. Joseph sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea, his eyes fixed on the window like he was watching ghosts. Malene, wrapped in a blanket and still wearing the same clothes that smelled like sweat and horsehair, sat on the couch with her legs drawn up to her chest, her gaze distant. "I need you to tell me the truth," Rachel said finally, her voice too quiet to be angry, too raw to be calm. "Why did you go in there?" Malene looked at her mother, then at her grandfather, and then back down at her hands. "I didn't," she said after a long pause. "They pushed me." Her voice was hoarse but steady. "It was a trap." Rachel closed her eyes, a tremor passing through her. "I knew something like this would happen. That horse, he's not safe, Malene. He could have killed you." "He didn't," Malene replied softly, and then, with more strength than either of them expected, she added, "because he didn't want to." Joseph turned toward her slowly. "You're saying he chose not to hurt you?" Malene nodded. He was scared, but he listened. He saw me, not what I look like, not how I walk, me, and I saw him. It sounded ridiculous, spoken aloud, like something from a dream. But neither of them laughed. Joseph didn't scoff, and Rachel didn't roll her eyes. Because they'd seen it too, maybe not with their own eyes in that moment, but in the aftermath, in the way Malene had emerged from that pen hole, in the way Wildfire had responded to her, not with violence, but with quiet understanding. "He's not just a wild animal," Malene said. "He's something else. And I think he needs someone who understands what it means to be trapped." Joseph leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin, still silent. Rachel walked over and knelt in front of her daughter, searching her face. "And you think that someone is you?" "I know it is," Malene said. No one spoke for a long time after that, but later that night, long after the house had gone still and the moonlight spilled across the frost-glazed fields, Joseph stood on the porch, staring toward the barn. The sky was clear, cold, filled with stars, and the wind carried the faint scent of hay and earth. Behind the fence, far in the shadows, a silhouette stood perfectly still, chestnut and proud, eyes reflecting starlight. And Joseph whispered into the night, "Maybe she's right." The morning after the hospital visit, everything felt changed, though nothing outwardly looked different. The frost still dusted the pasture like powdered sugar. The barn still creaked in protest as the wind pushed against its old boards, and Daisy still waited at the fence for Malene, her warm breath steaming in the crisp air. But inside the house, something fundamental had shifted. It was in the way Rachel lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, pretending to clean the same already wiped counter. It was in the way Joseph hovered by the front window with his coffee, not drinking it, just watching. And it was in the way Malene moved, slow, deliberate, but more purposeful. There was something in her eyes now that hadn't been there before, not just fire, but focus. At breakfast, the silence stretched long and awkward. No one wanted to bring up the pen, or the horse, or the 3 boys who had nearly gotten her killed. No one wanted to admit how close things had come to disaster. But eventually Malene looked up from her toast, her voice quiet but firm. "I want to see him again." Rachel's fork stopped midway to her mouth. Joseph lowered his mug. "Absolutely not," Rachel said, shaking her head before the sentence had even finished. "That horse is dangerous, Malene. You got lucky, that's all." "It wasn't luck," Malene replied. "He didn't hurt me because he didn't want to. I need to go back. I need to see if it was real." Joseph looked from his granddaughter to his daughter and back again. "Mark's going to have questions. He might not even let you near the pen again." "Let me talk to him," Malene said, straightening. "If I can show him what happened wasn't a fluke, maybe he'll give us a chance." Rachel's protest was instant. "Us? Malene, there is no us. You are not going to play horse whisperer with an animal that's already been flagged as a threat. You could have been killed." "But I wasn't," Malene replied, her tone sharpening. "You keep saying what could have happened. But what did happen is that he listened. He calmed down. He chose not to hurt me. Why doesn't that matter?" Joseph finally spoke slowly, cautiously. "Maybe because it sounds too much like a story, sweetheart, and Mark Sullivan's not a man who deals in stories. He deals in horses, bloodlines, training methods, insurance liability. But he saw it too," Malene said, gripping the edge of the table. "He saw what Wildfire did or didn't do. He knows something happened in that pen. I saw it in his face." Rachel shook her head and stood, bracing herself against the sink as if she could lean away from the weight of the conversation. "You don't understand how dangerous it gets when adults ignore warning signs. That horse is a lawsuit waiting to happen. He's already been marked as a liability. If he lashes out again, they'll have no choice but to put him down. This isn't just about you anymore." "I know it's not," Malene said. "That's why I have to help him, because no one else is going to." Later that afternoon, Malene rode with Joseph out to the Sullivan farm. The truck rattled and groaned down the dirt road, the tires crunching over gravel as they approached the gate. Mark was already waiting, standing near the barn with his arms crossed, his eyes shaded beneath the brim of his old feed store cap. His expression was unreadable as they climbed out. Wildfire was visible in the pen, pacing again, though not frantically, more like he was waiting for something, or someone. Joseph got straight to the point. "She wants to try again." Mark didn't answer immediately. He looked at Malene, then over at the Mustang. "You want to get back in there?" he asked, his tone more curious than skeptical. "Not today," she replied. "Not until we're both ready. But I want to work with him, from the outside, for now. I need to know what happened in there wasn't an accident." Mark was silent for a moment, then sighed. "That horse has put 2 men in the hospital," he said. 2 grown men with years of experience. I've had handlers walk away after 5 minutes. But you went in uninvited with nothing but fear and guts, and he didn't lay a hoof on you." He paused again, then added, "That shouldn't have happened." "But it did," Malene said, her voice steady. "And I think he's waiting to see if it'll happen again." Mark studied her. "You get 1 chance. You spook him, it's over. You understand me?" Malene nodded. "I won't spook him. I just want to show him he can trust me again." That first return visit was slow, deliberate. Malene approached the pen with Joseph and Mark at her side, standing just outside the fence. Wildfire looked up the moment she got close, his ears flicking forward, his body stilling. No pawing, no snorting, just a long, measured stare that held the weight of memory. Malene stood quietly for a few minutes, letting him get used to her presence again. Then she spoke, just softly, like she had in the pen. "Hey, it's me." Every day after that they came back. She never entered the enclosure, not yet, but she stayed by the fence for hours, talking, moving slowly, mirroring his pace, letting him decide when to come close. And he did, a little more each day. Sometimes she brought treats, apple slices, small chunks of carrot, which he accepted only after long pauses and intense staring. It wasn't affection, it wasn't obedience, but it was progress. Rachel didn't talk much about the visits. She didn't stop them either. She just watched her daughter grow steadier with each passing day, the tremble in her hands less noticeable, the limp in her step less pronounced as her core muscles responded to the daily effort. Malene had never been stronger, and it wasn't just physical, it was in her voice, her posture, her presence. She was building something more than a bond. She was building herself. By the end of the 2nd week, Mark admitted something he never thought he'd say. "That horse listens to you," he told her one afternoon, leaning on the fence. "He doesn't even pin his ears anymore when you're near. With anyone else, he still charges the gate." He looked at Joseph. "You might be onto something. She's got it, whatever it is." Joseph didn't respond. He just smiled faintly, watching his granddaughter and the Mustang circle each other in a quiet rhythm older than language. They didn't know it yet, but in those slow, patient afternoons, between the whispered encouragements, the careful movements, and the stillness that passed like trust being built 1 heartbeat at a time, something extraordinary was taking shape. Not just a second chance for a horse the world had given up on, but a new beginning for a girl who had spent most of her life being underestimated. And that was only the beginning. The morning sun broke over Stony Brook like a secret unfolding, painting the barn roofs gold and warming the frost off fence rails. The stillness was deceptive because today was anything but ordinary. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Malene first reconnected with Wildfire from outside the pen, and now, after patient, deliberate progress, she was about to take the first step that everyone, especially her mother, feared most. She was going inside, not by force, not as a victim, not to prove a point, but as a partner, as someone who'd earned the right to be there. It wasn't just the culmination of weeks of work, it was the beginning of something even larger, something she couldn't yet name but could feel in her bones, in the way Wildfire had watched her these last few days. No longer guarded, but expectant, like he knew this was coming and was just waiting for her to trust herself enough to do it. Joseph was waiting in the truck before she even stepped outside, his thermos steaming in the cup holder, hands resting on the wheel with the kind of quiet calm that only came from years of working the land and weathering storms, both literal and personal. When Malene climbed in, he didn't say anything. He just gave her a nod, one of those unspoken gestures that meant more than a paragraph ever could. "I trust you. I'm here." Let's go. She settled into the seat, her nerves tangled with anticipation, the kind that burned just beneath her skin like a current, the kind that didn't warn of danger, but of change. They arrived at the Sullivan farm just as the horses were beginning to stir, their breaths pluming in the cold morning air like ghost stories. Mark was already out, shoveling feed into troughs with his usual gruff efficiency, but when he saw Malene approaching with a halter draped over her shoulder, not in use, just carried, he paused. For once he didn't offer advice, warnings, or skepticism. He just stepped back, giving her the space she needed. That, in itself, was a kind of permission. Wildfire stood near the far end of the enclosure, still and poised, ears twitching at the sound of her footsteps but not moving away. He was taller than she remembered from that first terrifying encounter, or maybe she was just seeing him differently now, not as a danger to survive, but as a spirit to understand. She moved slowly, every step rehearsed, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gait uneven but unwavering. When she reached the gate, she paused, not because she was afraid, but because it felt right to acknowledge the moment. "Hey," she whispered, eyes locking with his. "I'm coming in now." She opened the latch carefully and stepped inside. The world narrowed. It was just her and Wildfire, a breath apart from everything else. She didn't walk straight to him. Instead, she moved in a soft arc, a wide, respectful curve that showed she wasn't there to dominate, only to be with him. He didn't flinch. He didn't pace. He just watched, his body calm but alert, reading her like a second language. Malene stopped several feet away, her hands open, palms facing down. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. They stood like that for what felt like forever, just two creatures who had every reason to fear and none to trust, choosing instead to try. Then, slowly, Wildfire took a step forward, then another and another, until his breath mingled with hers in the cool morning air and she could hear the soft creak of leather from his halter. He lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in acceptance. And Malene, her heart thudding in quiet triumph, reached up with one hand and let her fingers brush the side of his face. That touch was electric, not shocking or startling, but alive, real, as if something passed between them, not just familiarity, but recognition. You see me, I see you. Neither of us is what they said we were. From the fence line, Joseph and Mark stood in silence, neither willing to break the moment. It was Mark who finally whispered, "I've seen horses respond to riders, sure. I've seen trust built over time, but that's something else." "She's her mother's daughter," Joseph said quietly, eyes never leaving his granddaughter. The next 30 minutes unfolded like music. No sudden movements, no drama, just rhythm. Malene walked the pen's interior, and Wildfire followed, not pressed close, but in step. His pace matched to hers, as if he'd rehearsed it. She'd stop, and he'd stop. She'd turn, and he'd mirror her. There were no commands, no reins, no lead rope. Just intention and response. A conversation without words. And with every lap around that enclosure, it became clearer that this wasn't a breakthrough, this was a bond. When she finally stepped out of the pen, Wildfire didn't retreat. He stayed at the gate, watching her leave like he already missed her. She latched the door behind her and turned to Joseph and Mark, her hands still trembling slightly, but her eyes alight with something undeniable. Mark exhaled slowly, running a hand over his jaw. "I'll be honest, I thought this would end in a busted arm or worse. But that horse, he's yours now, whether we put it on paper or not." Malene didn't smile. She wasn't finished yet, because she knew this wasn't the end of something brave. It was the beginning of something sacred. Later that afternoon, back at home, Rachel was waiting on the porch. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable, but she didn't speak until Malene had come all the way up the steps. "Well?" was all she asked. Malene looked her mother in the eye. "He let me in." Rachel blinked. "He let you?" "He didn't just let me," Malene said, lowering herself carefully onto the porch swing. "He chose me, and I chose him." For a long time, Rachel said nothing. Then she sat beside her daughter and stared out across the field where Daisy grazed in slow, quiet circles. "You really believe that horse understands you?" "I know he does," Malene answered, "because I understand him." Rachel swallowed hard, her voice softer now. "Your father would have said the same thing. He used to talk like that about your mother, said she could look into a horse's eyes and see everything they'd ever been through. I thought it was romantic nonsense, but maybe I just didn't want to believe it." Malene looked at her. "You don't have to believe in magic, Mom. Just believe in me." Rachel didn't reply, but she reached for her daughter's hand, and in the quiet that followed, no more words were needed. That night, Malene lay in bed, her muscles sore but her spirit humming. She closed her eyes and saw him, Wildfire, standing at the fence, waiting. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like someone fighting against her own body. She felt like someone who belonged, not because she had proven herself to the world, but because she had finally stopped trying to prove anything at all. And somewhere beyond the walls of the old farmhouse, a chestnut Mustang stood under the stars, still and calm, watching the house like he knew exactly where his girl was, and knew she'd be back. The days following the first real breakthrough with Wildfire felt like a dream, but one that Malene could never quite wake up from. Every morning she would wake before the sun and make her way to the barn, her breath visible in the chill, her hands numb as she prepared for the day ahead. The world outside her home had been turned upside down by Wildfire, and by extension, her own life. No longer was she the girl with the limp and the shaking hands, trying to survive each day, trying to keep her disability from becoming the focal point of every conversation. Now she was someone who had found a purpose, and that purpose was Wildfire. Joseph and Mark had both witnessed the growing connection between Malene and the Mustang, and while neither of them expressed it aloud, they both felt it. Malene had become a force, not just in how she worked with the horse, but in how she carried herself. There was a quiet strength in her now, a confidence that hadn't been there before. But the truth of it settled on her in strange ways. At night, she would lie awake in her bed, listening to the wind howl outside, and wondering if it was all real, if she had truly found something that made her feel complete, if Wildfire had truly chosen her. The thought was so incredible, it made her head spin. And then there was the rest of the world, the part of her life that was still a mess. At school, the rumors continued to swirl. She was no longer the invisible girl. Now she was the Mustang Whisperer, the girl who could calm the wildest animal in the county, the girl whose touch could change a creature that was known for being unpredictable and dangerous. Some students were fascinated by her newfound reputation, asking questions, marveling at how she had managed to do what trainers with years of experience couldn't. Some were even jealous. Caleb Mitchell, who had once tormented her, seemed to be waiting for her to fail, watching from a distance like a hawk waiting for the moment to strike. He didn't understand what had happened, and neither did most people. They couldn't see what she saw. They couldn't feel what she felt. They couldn't see Wildfire's eyes softening when he looked at her, his stance no longer stiff but relaxed. The whispers in the hallways weren't all mean-spirited, though. Some came with admiration, though it was subtle and cautious, as if they too were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sarah Reynolds, her former friend, had begun to apologize in small ways. At first, it had been awkward. She avoided making eye contact in the halls, unsure how to act after everything that had happened. But the more time passed, the more Sarah softened. One afternoon, as they sat together in the library, Sarah said, "I saw that video, Malene. The one with Wildfire. You really can do it, can't you?" Malene looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read. "It's not magic, Sarah. It's just trust. He trusts me, and I trust him." Sarah shifted in her seat, looking like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. "I was wrong," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "About you, about him. I didn't believe you, but now I see it." Malene felt a pang in her chest, an unfamiliar ache at the back of her throat. "It's okay," she said quietly, unsure of whether she meant it. "You didn't know." But Sarah wasn't finished. "I didn't know, but I'm sorry. For everything." Malene nodded, unsure of how to respond, but a small part of her knew that, in that moment, Sarah was genuinely sorry, and it was enough for now. At home, things were no better. Rachel, though more supportive than she had been in weeks, still hesitated whenever Malene mentioned returning to Sullivan's farm. She never said outright that Malene couldn't go, but the concern in her eyes was constant. "Promise me you won't push yourself too hard, Malene," she would say. "You've already proven what you're capable of. Just don't get hurt again." And yet, Malene knew that she couldn't stop. She couldn't let this slip away, this feeling of purpose, of being more than what the world had decided she should be. She had to keep going. She had to see it through, not just for Wildfire, but for herself. It was on one of those late afternoons, the sky dimming with the coming of evening, that Malene stood outside the pen, waiting for Wildfire. The air had cooled, and the faint scent of hay and earth filled her senses as she watched the Mustang pacing. His steps were measured, his powerful frame moving with an ease that made her heart race. There was a quiet elegance to the way he moved, like he knew exactly how to carry himself, exactly how to command attention without demanding it. He was wild, but he was becoming something else, something she recognized, a spirit not confined by the world's limitations. When he saw her, he stopped, the briefest of pauses, as though he had made a decision, and then he walked toward her, slow, deliberate, no hesitation. Malene's heart fluttered. This was the moment. This was the culmination of everything. She opened the gate, and instead of retreating as he had once done, he stepped forward. She could feel it, feel the trust he had placed in her. She knew she had earned this moment, not because of who she was or who they all thought she should be, but because of what they had built together. She stepped into the pen, her legs a little unsteady, but her heart sure. Wildfire was already there, standing a few feet away. His nostrils flared, and for a moment Malene thought he might pull back. But instead he stood, watching her, waiting. She approached him slowly, every step deliberate, her hand stretched out, palm facing forward, an invitation, not a command. When she reached him, his head lowered slightly, his gaze softening. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. They were communicating in a way that words couldn't touch. For what felt like hours, they stood there, Malene's breath mingling with his, her fingers brushing along his neck. He was still wild, still the Mustang that had terrified everyone. But now, he was her Mustang. And they both understood something important, something that neither fear nor doubt could undo. He wasn't an animal to be tamed. He was a partner to be respected. And in return, he gave her something more than trust. He gave her a sense of belonging she had never known before. Mark Sullivan watched from the edge of the pen, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. For the first time in all the years he'd worked with horses, he saw something different in this girl. He'd never been one to believe in magic, and yet, there it was. Something that had begun as a desperate attempt to make sense of the chaos in her life was slowly, steadily turning into a partnership that might just change everything. "You're doing it, kid," Mark muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Joseph, standing beside him, nodded. "She's always had it in her, just took the right horse to bring it out." Malene didn't hear them. She didn't need to. What she needed, what she had found, was standing right in front of her. The bond between her and Wildfire wasn't just about the hours they'd spent together or the way he had let her into his world. It was about trust, trust that had been broken time and time again in her life but was now being healed, piece by fragile piece, by a creature who had known nothing but survival and pain. And now, at long last, they were both learning to live, to thrive. When Malene stepped out of the pen that evening, her heart was full. not with pride, not with arrogance, but with something much deeper, a quiet satisfaction that she had done what no one else had thought possible. She had connected with the wildness of wildfire, and in return, she had found something even more precious, herself. But the hardest part was yet to come, because as much as they had achieved together, the world outside Stony Brook was watching, and not everyone was happy about it. The next few days felt like they were moving too fast, and yet time seemed to slow when Malene was around Wildfire. The world outside of the farm, with its whispers, judgments, and subtle cruelty, pressed in on her, but when she was with him, everything faded into the background. The horses, the pastures, the wind in the trees, it was all so clear. It was just them, her and him, speaking a language that no one else could understand. And in that space, she was free. The bond between them had become something almost sacred, something deeper than either of them could fully comprehend. There were moments, small but powerful, when she'd pause, her fingers brushing through Wildfire's mane, or feeling the heat of his body as he stood by her side, and it was as if the world held its breath, waiting for them to do something more, something that would prove that their connection was real. But outside that sanctuary, things were starting to get more complicated. The town of Stony Brook was no stranger to gossip. The tight-knit community thrived on stories, and Malene's story had become the latest and most talked about tale. Everywhere she went, there was something in the way people looked at her. Some were full of awe, even reverence. "Is it true?" they'd ask, as if they couldn't believe it. "Can you really calm that wild Mustang?" But there were others, quieter voices in the crowd, who were skeptical, dismissive, even hostile. They didn't understand what Malene had done, what Wildfire had become. They didn't believe it. And if they didn't understand it, it had to be wrong. The whispers became harder to ignore, especially when they came from people she thought she could trust. At school, Caleb Mitchell's shadow loomed over her every step. After everything that had happened with the pen, the way he'd pushed her into Wildfire's space, Caleb's silence was more unnerving than his taunts had ever been. He didn't need to say anything. His eyes were always on her, watching, calculating, waiting. She could almost feel the weight of his gaze on her back when she passed him in the halls, but she kept her chin up, determined not to let his presence dictate her every move. The tension grew when word got out about the video. The footage of Malene standing in the pen with Wildfire, still calm, the horse standing beside her like he had chosen her as his companion, had made its rounds, first among the local horse enthusiasts, and then further afield. It didn't take long for it to spread beyond Stony Brook. The video became an internet sensation, racking up views from people all over the world. Forums for horse training and wild horse rehabilitation exploded with discussion about the girl who had tamed the untamable. News outlets, small and large, picked up the story. The local paper ran a piece about the Mustang Whisperer, and suddenly Malene was no longer the quiet girl who kept to herself. She was a subject of fascination. Her inbox was flooded with messages. Some were from people praising her, asking for advice, or sharing their own stories about troubled animals. But there were others, less kind. Criticism poured in from those who believed she was dangerous for getting so close to a wild animal. They didn't see her as someone who had built trust with Wildfire. They saw her as someone who had defied nature. To them, the idea that a girl with a disability could make a wild Mustang bend to her will was an affront. It was something that shouldn't happen, a mistake. They couldn't fathom what had truly taken place in that pen. The thought that Malene might have earned Wildfire's trust, might have been accepted by him for reasons beyond the superficial, was too complicated for them to grasp. The pressure began to weigh heavily on Malene. It wasn't just the online criticism, the gossip at school, or Caleb's unsettling stares. It was the realization that Wildfire had become a symbol, not just of her success, but of something people were desperate to control. They didn't want to believe that a girl could do what trainers with decades of experience couldn't. They didn't want to believe that this wasn't about power or dominance, but about understanding. Wildfire had become a challenge, and when something becomes a challenge, people start seeing it as something that needs to be beaten into submission. They didn't see him as a creature to be respected, but as a problem to be solved. One evening, as Malene sat on the porch with her grandfather, she found herself thinking about the future, about the reality of what it would mean to continue on this path. Her heart was set on helping Wildfire, helping other misunderstood horses, but she couldn't deny the growing sense of unease that tugged at her. "Grandpa," she said, her voice uncertain, "what if I'm not ready for this? What if it all falls apart?" Joseph was quiet for a moment. His gaze turned out to the fields where Wildfire was grazing, his body moving like fluid through the tall grass. "You've been ready for a long time, Malene," he said softly. "The world doesn't always give us the chances we want or the ones we think we deserve. But it's giving you this one. Don't waste it. Just because people are scared doesn't mean you should stop." "But they don't understand," she said, her throat tight. "I can't make them understand. They don't see him the way I do." "You can't make anyone see what they're not ready to see," Joseph said. "But don't let them tear you down just because they don't get it. They're just scared, Malene. They're scared of what they don't understand. You've got to stand tall in that fear. And Wildfire, he's not just your horse now. He's part of something bigger. He's showing the world that sometimes the most unlikely bonds are the strongest." Her grandfather's words lingered in the air between them, heavy with the weight of truth, yet still tinged with an undeniable sadness. Joseph understood more than anyone how hard it could be to push forward when the world seemed determined to stop you. But he also knew that Malene wasn't like anyone else. She had something few people could even dream of, a connection that was real, pure, and true. No one could take that from her, not even the world's most vocal critics. The next morning, Malene returned to the farm earlier than usual, her heart racing with a combination of excitement and nervousness. She had something to prove, not to anyone else, but to herself. She wasn't going to let the fear of what people thought dictate the course of her life. She walked into the barn, where Joseph was already checking the feed and making sure everything was in order for the day's work. His presence was reassuring, steady and grounded, like the land beneath their feet. But Malene couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at stake here than just Wildfire's future. "Grandpa," she said, as he looked up from his work, "I think I need to go see Mark Sullivan today." Joseph frowned slightly, his brow furrowing in concern. "You're not thinking of selling him, are you?" "No," Malene replied, shaking her head. "I'm thinking about what comes next. Wildfire deserves more than just a life in a pen. I need to talk to Mark about helping other horses. I can't let this end with just him." Joseph studied her for a long moment, as if weighing the decision, but then nodded. "I understand. But you remember, this won't be easy. You're not just changing Wildfire's future, Malene. You're changing everything. You'll be stepping into a world that's not always kind. You'll face people who don't believe in what you're doing. They'll fight you." "I know," Malene said, meeting his gaze, her voice determined, "but I'm ready." The trip to Sullivan's farm felt like it lasted an eternity. When they arrived, Mark was standing by the gate, a weathered expression on his face as if he had been expecting them. Malene took a deep breath and approached him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice steady despite the nerves. "I want to help more horses like Wildfire. There are others out there, wild, untamed, misunderstood. They need someone to see them for what they are, not just what people think they are. I want to start working with them, but I can't do it alone." Mark studied her for a long moment. "And you want my help?" Malene nodded. "Not just mine. I want to create a program, a place where we can rehabilitate horses like Wildfire, give them a second chance. But I need people who understand what I'm doing, people who will back me." Mark's eyes softened, the faintest trace of approval in them. "You've got the touch, kid. You've got something rare. But it's going to take a hell of a lot of work. You're not just talking about saving horses. You're talking about changing how people see them. and changing how they see you too. "I'm ready," Malene said, her voice strong, filled with conviction. Mark nodded slowly. "Well then, let's get started." Malene's heart soared. She had just taken the first step, not just for Wildfire, but for every horse out there who had been written off as too dangerous or too wild to ever belong. And in that moment, she knew. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. There were people who believed in her, who believed in the impossible. And the impossible was just getting started. The days were beginning to blur together as Malene settled into the rhythm of her new reality. The morning started early with Wildfire, before the sun even peeked over the horizon. The barn was quiet and still, the kind of silence that felt sacred, almost as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. She would arrive, careful not to make any noise as she walked through the barn so that she wouldn't disturb the calm of the place. Wildfire, as always, was already there, standing at the edge of his pen, his dark eyes waiting. He had become more than just a horse to her. He was a partner, a friend, a force of nature that understood her in a way that no one else ever had. And when she would step into the pen with him, they were in their own world, a world where nothing else mattered except their trust in each other. It wasn't just the bond between her and Wildfire that had deepened in the weeks since she had decided to start the program. The farm too had begun to change. Joseph had become more involved, despite his initial reluctance to let her go forward with her plans. He had seen the way Wildfire had responded to Malene, and he knew this wasn't just some fleeting dream. It was real. And though he had been wary about getting involved in something that might bring more trouble than it was worth, he had come to understand that this wasn't just about Malene and Wildfire anymore. It was about something bigger, something that could change the lives of not just the horses, but the people who needed them. Still, the obstacles were real. When Malene spoke to Mark Sullivan about starting the rehabilitation program, he had listened carefully, nodding with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. For all his gruff exterior, Mark understood what Malene was trying to do. He had seen too many wild horses get captured, broken, and eventually destroyed because they were misunderstood. He had been one of the few who truly believed that some horses could be rehabilitated, but even he had his doubts about Malene's idea. He knew it would take more than just the right training. It would take a community. It would take patience, determination, and a level of care that not everyone would be willing to give. "Kid, you're asking for a lot," he had said the day she brought up her idea. "This isn't a simple task. It's not just about teaching horses to trust. You're going to have to teach people to trust too, and that's going to be the hardest part of all." Malene had nodded, her eyes firm with the kind of certainty that came from knowing deep down she was doing the right thing. "I know it's going to be hard, Mark, but I can't walk away from this. There are horses out there that deserve a chance. Wildfire deserves a chance. I'm not doing this just for him. I'm doing this for all of them." Mark had studied her for a long time before finally speaking again. "Well, if you're serious about this, then let's see what we can do. But it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight." And so the work began. The first step was securing a place for the horses. Malene's vision for the program had always been to create a space where horses could be rehabilitated, where they could learn to trust again, and where people could learn to work with them in a way that was compassionate, not forceful. But the reality was that the West family farm had been in a state of disrepair for years. The barn needed work, the fences were aging, and the land itself was barely enough to sustain the few horses they had left. Malene knew that if she was going to make this work, she would need more than just Wildfire. She would need support. And so she turned to the community. The same community that had whispered behind her back and doubted her at every turn. She began to reach out to everyone she knew, people who had worked with horses for decades, people who understood the delicate balance between the wild and the tame, people who had the skills and the experience she didn't yet have. Some were hesitant at first, unsure if the program was worth investing in. Others were skeptical, questioning how a 15-year-old girl could possibly know enough to start something like this. But slowly, they started to come around. They saw Maline's commitment, her passion, and most importantly, her unwavering belief in the horses. She wasn't just trying to create a business. She was trying to change the way people saw the animals who had been cast aside by society. Mark, though reluctant at first, eventually agreed to help. His wealth of experience was invaluable, and he quickly became a mentor to Maline, teaching her things she hadn't even considered. How to read a horse's body language, the best ways to build trust, the importance of consistency. Mark had worked with horses his entire life, but he had never seen someone quite like Maline, someone who didn't just train horses, but who connected with them. They shared a language, a bond that went deeper than just commands or reactions. It was a silent understanding that transcended everything they'd been taught. And soon, Mark was beginning to believe that this program could be more than just a way to rehabilitate horses. It could change everything, but it wasn't easy. The first few horses Maline worked with were difficult. Some were untrusting and angry, having been subjected to years of neglect or mistreatment. Others were wild to the point of dangerous, their instincts to flee and fight still strong. Maline took it all in stride. Every morning she would arrive before anyone else, spending hours in the barn, working with the horses one by one. It wasn't glamorous work, it wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And with each passing day, she began to see the transformation in the horses and in herself. However, the more she worked, the more she realized just how much work she still had to do. Not just with the horses, but with the community. There were still people in Stony Brook who didn't understand what she was doing. They didn't understand the work it took to get to where she was, or the patience it required. They still saw her as the girl who had been thrown in the pen with Wildfire, the girl who was too disabled to do anything of significance. They couldn't see her for what she truly was, a young woman who had found a purpose and a passion that burned brighter than anything she had ever known before. The turning point came when Maline was asked to speak at a local town meeting. It was an opportunity she hadn't expected, but one that she couldn't turn down. The invitation had come from the local Ranchers Association, many of whom had been watching her progress with Wildfire and had begun to see the value in her work. But the invitation wasn't without its risks. There were still plenty of people in Stony Brook who doubted her, who thought she was wasting her time, who thought her vision was foolish and impractical. The meeting was bound to be a battleground, one that could either solidify her place in the community or mark the end of her dreams. Maline stood at the front of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she held onto the podium. She had never been one for public speaking. It wasn't something she had ever been comfortable with. But as she looked around the room at the faces staring back at her, some kind, some skeptical, she found her voice. She didn't talk about her disability or about Wildfire specifically. She talked about the horses, the ones who had been written off, who had been given no chance to prove themselves. She talked about the importance of seeing them as more than just animals to be controlled, but as beings who could connect with people on a deeper level, if only they were given the opportunity. "When I started this," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves, "I didn't know where it would go. I didn't know how people would react. I just knew that something had to change. These horses, they're not broken. They're not untrainable. They just need someone to believe in them, someone who sees them for who they really are, not just what others have told them to be." The room fell silent. For a moment, Maline thought she had lost them, but then, one by one, people began to nod. They began to see, and that's when Maline realized this wasn't just about horses anymore. It was about changing hearts and minds. It was about showing people that anything was possible, even when the odds were stacked against you. The meeting ended with applause, not loud or boisterous, but respectful. People began to approach her afterward, some asking for advice, others offering support. And just like that, something had shifted. Maline was no longer the girl they had whispered about. She was the girl who had turned the impossible into the possible. And suddenly, the future didn't seem so uncertain after all. The days that followed the town meeting felt like a whirlwind. Word had spread quickly through Stony Brook, and the reaction was more than Maline had ever anticipated. Some people were still skeptical, of course. There would always be those who couldn't see beyond the surface, those who judged her before understanding the depth of what she had accomplished. But there were more people, more than she had imagined, who were beginning to see her for who she really was, someone who was not just trying to prove a point, but someone with a genuine passion for helping animals, for understanding them in a way few people ever would. And that was enough to keep her going, to keep the fire burning inside her. The horses, too, had begun to show more progress. Wildfire, of course, had always been the most responsive, but he wasn't the only one. Slowly but surely, the other horses that had once been seen as unmanageable or dangerous were beginning to trust Meline. It was a long and delicate process, each day bringing new challenges, but there was something about the work that resonated with her. She had always felt like she didn't quite belong, like her disability made her different in ways she couldn't control. But when she was with the horses, it was as if all of that melted away. She wasn't different. She was just there, a person and an animal, connecting in a way that transcended everything else. And with each breakthrough, whether it was a horse allowing her to approach without fear, or a young mare taking its first steps toward trusting a human again, Meline knew she was on the right path. Mark Sullivan had continued to be a steady presence, though he had taken a step back, allowing Meline to take the lead in the day-to-day operations of the program. He was still around, offering advice when it was needed, but he respected Meline's vision and her drive. He had been skeptical at first, unsure of whether a young girl could truly change the fate of these horses, but he was coming around. He saw the way the horses responded to Meline, saw the trust that had developed between them, and he couldn't deny it anymore. She was more than capable. She was special. And yet, despite all the progress they were making, there was always the looming shadow of the Mitchell family. Caleb and his friends had been keeping their distance since the incident at the Sullivan farm, but Meline couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb's hostility wasn't gone. The way he watched her from across the school halls, the way his eyes seemed to follow her every move, it felt like a silent challenge. It was as if he was waiting for her to slip up, to make a mistake, to prove that she didn't belong in this world she was so desperately trying to create. One afternoon, Meline was walking back to the barn after a long day, working with one of the new horses, when she saw Caleb waiting for her by the fence. His posture was casual, but there was something in the way he stood that made Meline's heart skip a beat. She had been expecting this moment for weeks now. She had known that eventually Caleb would come for her, that he would have to confront her. What she didn't expect was the cold, calculating look in his eyes. It was as if he was trying to figure her out, trying to break through the shell she had built around herself. "Hey, Wobbles," Caleb called out, his voice smooth, but with an edge that sent a chill down Meline's spine. "I hear you're doing big things with that horse of yours." Meline didn't flinch, but she could feel her pulse quickening. She had to stay calm. She had to stay in control. "What do you want, Caleb?" He shrugged, the movement almost too practiced, as if he were pretending not to care. "Just curious. Everyone's talking about you, about your wild horse whispering. Thought I'd come see it for myself." Meline crossed her arms over her chest, standing her ground. "What do you want from me?" Caleb paused for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he studied her, like he was measuring her every word, every movement. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "Maybe you're right, about the horses. Maybe there's something to it." He took a step closer, but Meline didn't move, her eyes locked on his. "But you're not going to get far without the right people behind you. You need support, you need money, and you need connections." Meline felt a flicker of suspicion, but she kept her face neutral. She had learned long ago not to trust Caleb Mitchell, and she wasn't about to start now. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Caleb said, his voice now tinged with something darker, "I could help you. My dad could help you. He has connections in the agricultural industry. He could get your program the backing it needs, maybe even bring in some funding, but there's a price." Meline's stomach twisted. What price? Caleb's smile was thin and humorless. I'll tell you what, I'll put in a good word for you. I'll talk to my dad. But you'll need to make it clear to everyone that you couldn't have done this without us, without me. The words hung in the air, and Malene felt a rush of anger flood through her. She could already hear the whispers, the way they would twist her story if she agreed to Caleb's terms. It wasn't just about the program anymore. It was about control. Caleb was trying to take something that wasn't his, something that Malene had worked for, something that had nothing to do with him. He wasn't offering help. He was offering to buy her out, to turn her story into something that could fit his narrative. I don't need your help, Malene said, her voice firm, steady. I'm doing this on my own. I don't need anyone to speak for me. I don't need anyone to make it easier for me. What I'm doing with these horses, what I've done with Wildfire, it's real, and I'm not going to let anyone take that from me. For a moment, Caleb said nothing. His face remained unreadable, his gaze calculating, as if he hadn't expected this response. But then he laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. You think you can do this alone, Wobbles? You think you can just ignore the people who can make or break you? He took a step back, shaking his head. Good luck. You're gonna need it. Malene watched as he turned and walked away, his back straight and proud, as if he had won something. But Malene knew the truth. He hadn't won anything. He had just revealed exactly who he was. He was trying to control everything, to take credit for things that didn't belong to him. But she wasn't going to let him. She wasn't going to let him destroy everything she had worked for. Later that evening, as Malene sat on the porch of the West Farm, the wind picking up and rustling through the trees, Joseph came out to sit beside her. He could tell something was bothering her, but he didn't push her to speak. He just waited. Malene let out a long sigh, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. It's Caleb. He came to see me today. He wants to help me, but only if I do things his way. He wants me to make it look like I couldn't have done any of this without him. Joseph's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. And what did you say? I told him no, Malene said, her voice quiet but resolute. I don't need him. I don't need his help. I'm doing this for the horses, not for him. Joseph's hand rested on her shoulder, a silent show of support. Good. You don't need him. What you're doing, Malene, it's bigger than him. Bigger than any of them. They might not see it now, but they will. People like Caleb, people who think they can control everything. They'll always be out there. But you're doing something real, something that can't be taken away. Don't let them distract you. Malene nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink deep into her chest. She had been afraid that she couldn't do this on her own, afraid that somehow Caleb was right. But now, sitting here with her grandfather, she realized something. She didn't need anyone else to tell her what she was capable of. She had already proven it to herself, and now she just had to keep going, keep moving forward. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, challenges, people who tried to tear her down, but she wouldn't let them win. Not now, not ever. The next morning, as the sun rose over the farm, Malene walked out to the barn, her heart light, her purpose clear. Wildfire was waiting for her, standing tall in the early light, his mane blowing gently in the wind. He was more than just a horse to her. He was a symbol of everything she had fought for, everything she had built. And together, they were unstoppable. The journey was far from over. But Malene knew with certainty that she was ready for whatever came next.